In this lesson, you'll learn how variables can be used to make your programs more dynamic. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to control the speed of your sprite, and we'll introduce a new level of unpredictability using randomness. Alright, so we've already talked about how a variable is a placeholder, and we're going to expand on that. So take a look at this equation. Now, if you're having high blood pressure right now from having to look at this, of course, hopefully you recognize this from algebra. Keep in mind, yes, there are a lot of variables involved in this equation. And when you had to use this, of course, you had to keep straight which was A, which was B, which was C, and find out the different values for all of those things. Now, it could have been something much more simple, such as 3x plus 5 equals 20. A much simpler expression with a variable. Regardless of how complex or simple an equation is, if there's a variable involved, then of course it's kind of almost like hide and seek. So we know that that variable holds a particular value, and it's our job to figure out what it is. So in computer programming, a variable has a similar function. It holds a place, and of course we know from the ask and answer that the value of a variable can change. We will look at a couple of examples of things as we've seen them in Scratch. So in Scratch, we already talked about reporter blocks, and we know that we can put a check mark in the 3 that you see here on the screen. It can show it on the screen as our cat or whatever sprite we happen to have chosen at that point in time. It'll constantly be reporting that value. And of course, we know that that changes all the time. Every time we move our sprite, we have a different combination of X and Y values. We've also used these other blocks over here on the right. For example, these top two are the changing of X and Y. It's our command to say, all right, we don't really care what your current X value or your current Y value is, but whatever that current value is, we want you to increase it by 10 or decrease it by 10 or by some other number. So we're able to not worry about the current value, but just change it from wherever it is. Same thing with the bottom two. We're able to say, all right, regardless of whatever position you're pointing in, whether you're pointing to the left or to the right or up or down or some random position or random direction, then we'll just say wherever you are, you can turn 15 degrees to the right or to the left. And so those don't necessarily depend on, it doesn't matter what the current X or Y position is, you just change it. All right. So you'll get a chance to try out on your own using some system variables. We have talked about random numbers. We know that we can use random numbers. If you are a fan of video games, random number generators are a big part of what make video games exciting. Because if you knew what was going to happen every single time, that would not be fun. You could predict, you could beat the game. But because a lot of video games utilize random functions for graphics as well as for movement of the sprites, it does lend more of a realistic feel to your games. So random numbers are pretty important. And we used the random numbers in the Scratch demonstration, and you have seen these things, and you know that, for example, something like this over here, set that to a minimum value and to any maximum value, and you are going to get, every time you use that block, a number somewhere in between that max and min. And not knowing what it's going to be kind of adds to the excitement. So how else can that be used? Well, we could have our sprite actually say some random things or say a random number so that our user could see that different number pop up on the screen and not have an idea about which one it was going to be. Another example of this would be if you were going to play like a heads or tails type of game, and you could pick a random number from 1 to 2, and then if it happens to be a 1, you could set that as heads and behave as if they rolled a heads, or flipped, whatever the term is when you are flipping a coin, they flipped heads. Or if it was a 2, they flipped tails, or the other way around. But either way, it would be random. Like the user wouldn't know for sure if they were picking the right one. And of course, we've got all the options below where we can move a random number of steps. We can turn a random number of degrees. We could even pick some random note and play it for half a second. Selecting a random pen size and setting X to a random position. So take a look at what we've got over here. So this is interesting. We've joined several blocks together. So if you pick this out, you can see there's one pick random blank to blank, right? So they set some number here, and then the other one was some number over here. So what they did is they actually took another pick random and put it in that first one right there. Now that drawing looks like a mess, but you can see that there are definitely three. Here's the other one right here. They took another pick random and put it in there. So let's pick this apart. It's going to pick a random number between, so here's the minimum. The minimum is going to be a random number between 1 and 10. So we don't even know what the minimum number is going to be. The maximum is going to be some number over here between 10 and 100. So could it ultimately happen that it says pick a random number between 10 and 10? Sure. It's not highly likely, but it sure could happen. So if the minimum number is a random number as well as the maximum number, boy, that's even a trickier combination to find out what it is that we are going to get. All right, so we know we can randomly move a sprite. And we can actually set the coordinates to make sure now in the negative 240 and the positive 240 for the x coordinate, those are the extents of the backdrop of the stage. If you go further than negative 240, if you go into the negative 250s and the negative 300, you're actually moving off the stage to the left. Now you can do that if you want your sprite to disappear, and then you can bring it back, but that's why these particular numbers were used. And the same thing with the set Y. Obviously, the bottommost point of your screen vertically is going to be the negative 180. And if you go further than that, away from the 0 point, then you are actually moving off the screen. So those are some things to keep in mind when you are randomly moving a sprite, is to actually, make sure you keep them within the bounds of the screen, if that's what you want to do. All right, and so something that I haven't shown you, but you can absolutely do to make sure that you know exactly where your sprite is, and if the positions don't seem to be working for you, there's a background that you can choose in the Scratch gallery that is an XY coordinate plane. And so you can actually see your cat move around on the coordinate plane and find out which quadrant your sprite is in and all of that. An important thing to remember as well is that this is measured from the center point of your sprite. So you might think, well, the bottom of my cat's feet, I want the bottom of the cat's feet to go to negative 180 because I want it to look like the cat is on the ground. However, that won't quite work because what they're doing is they're measuring like from right here on the sprite. And so that's something important to remember, especially when you have bigger sprites and you're trying to position them and they don't seem to position well. It's always from the center point of the sprite. All right, so a few things to discuss. So first of all, how is the pick random block an example of an input? Well, you saw it. When we use the pick random block, we put it in to one of the expressions or one of the commands in Scratch. And so it is input because we put it in. And that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, but it does the trick. That's what input is. It's a value that has to be put in to the command in order for it to run. If there were nothing there, it wouldn't run. So something has to be there, and we put it in. We used a pick random. And obviously you can see the connection between randomness and variables. For one thing, the pick random number itself, once that number is picked, it is used in place of a variable. It is a variable. And so it's nice to be able to use those. And what functionality does pick random give to variables? Well, we talked about it. They can become a little bit less predictable, a little bit more exciting if we don't know exactly what's going to happen. You can even get to a point where, again, like a flipping a coin type of game, where you can actually start creating some games using randomness. All right, so now you get a chance to play around with randomness to make your program more exciting. Scratch allows the creation of custom variables. So we can go in and even though they give us a lot of variables to get started with, for example, we talked about the X position and the Y position and the answer and costume number and all that kind of stuff. They give us a lot of variables to get started with. However, we know that it's also really convenient for us to be able to make our own variables so that we can create new behaviors and new attributes for our sprites. So we'll do a little exercise here. We know that in a lot of games and a lot of simulations, it's important that the sprite or the main part of the program have a speed. And so we know that we can go to Scratch, we can go to the dark orange section, and we can create a variable. And so we'll do a little exercise to find out just why it's useful to have a variable take the place of speed, especially if we're looking at multiple sprites, instead of just typing a number into a motion block. Finally, to review. When you create a variable, you create a custom variable, or even the my variable that they give you, although you don't want to use that because that's not a good name. There are two things that you can do with it, and you can set the value of the variable, which a lot of times at the beginning of a program, you do want to set the value of the variable so you're sure that when the user restarts your program, the variable has gone back to the same value. So setting the variable is important, but we can also change the variable. And remember, when we talked about the motion blocks changing the X and Y coordinate, changing the direction by turning 15 degrees, it doesn't matter what the variable is set to at that particular moment. It just says whatever value it has at the moment, we are just going to increase it or decrease it. So when we talk about the change and the set blocks, we know that same thing for, let's say, these variables that we're looking at. For example, a score variable, that you would want to set the score to 0 at the beginning of the game. But obviously it's going to change somewhere in the game, or there would be no game. So in terms of changing, if you think of, like, for example, a checkbook balancing program, and I don't know, you mow a yard or something like that, and you get paid $5, and so you can change the balance by a positive 5. You could also, unfortunately, change the balance by a negative number if you had to go out and buy something that you didn't know you were going to have to purchase. So we can change by positive and negative numbers, but changing just means it doesn't matter what that value was to begin with. We're just going to change it. All right, and so you should be good to go to do some pretty cool experiments in Scratch, developing programs using variables, using different types of variables, and doing different things with those variables to make your programs interesting.